all God's people said, Amen. Well, good morning. I am delighted to be with you this morning and grateful for this opportunity to be in worship with you. I do bring you greetings from the Reverend Dr. Terry Hoard Owens, who is our general minister and president. It's through her office that we share and see the unity of who we are as the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the United States and Canada, worshiping in some 3,000 congregations on Sunday morning, just like this, some 400,000 of us across that same space. And she would want me to say thank you for your generous support of Disciple Mission Fund and the way you allow us to express the ministry of the Christian church in so many places, both here at home and around the world. So please receive those greetings from Dr. Owens. And I have come with a question. And that question is, what do you hope for? What do you hope for? Well, I expect some of you are hoping for nice weather at 5:30 tonight for trunk or treat, right? I mean, absolutely. And it looks like that's going to happen. That's wonderful. It's pouring rain at my house right now, so I'm happy for you that the sun is shining. But what do you hope for? I suspect a few of you might be hoping for an Astros win in the World Series tonight, right? I know where I am. James, where are those shoes that your piano player was wearing? I know what he's hoping for, right? Those are great. I've never seen anything like that before. Those are wonderful. A few of you might be hoping the Cowboys might make it back to the Super Bowl. Now, there are some things that might be beyond hope, but we'll hold on. I understand that. I'm a Cleveland Browns fan, okay? And we don't have enough time to go there. And I can tell by the look on a few of your faces, you're hoping this preacher doesn't preach too long, so perhaps we should get on with it. I remember years ago the late Peter Gomes telling a story about a member of the British consulate who was being interviewed at the holiday time. And you know how the news, stations go out and do that. And the question for all of these folks was, well, what do you hope for this Christmas? Well, this particular fellow just sort of hemmed and hawed and pondered for a moment, and then he said, well, I guess I'm hoping for a jar of those wonderful fruit preserves like they have at Herod's department store. Now, never mind that other members of the consulate were hoping for world peace, and a cure for AIDS, and maybe a little more kindness, in the world. The biggest hope he seemed to be able to muster was jam for his morning toast. So I ask you, what do you hope for? I don't mean what do you wish for. I mean, what do you hope for? I mean, wishes are for jams and jellies and sunny days for our events and for our sports teams to beat their rivals. But in the end, those things are of little consequence. I'm talking about what do you hope for when hope's all you've got to hang on to? What do you hope for that's big enough and bold enough to sustain you in difficult times? And I mean, we live in a very complicated time right now, do we not? I mean, we have the threat of a nuclear-armed North Korea with a leader who allegedly, I love that word when the newspapers report, allegedly fed one of his generals to a tank full of piranhas this summer. I mean, holy James Bond, what kind of world have we come to? The world's complicated. We now have instability along the Turkish border, more Russian influence, and an uncertain future for the Kurds in that corner of the world. And international trade seems to be determined more by a tweet than a sound policy. This is a very complicated time in which we live. More than any other time that I can recall, it seems our elected officials are more interested in scoring points against each other than in working for us who sent them there. It's difficult. They haven't figured out that they're supposed to be working for the greater good. We live in a world where 25,000 people die every day due to poverty, due to lack of access for clean water, or simple medications you and I pick up at the Walgreens in aisle 5. I dare say we need more than wishful thinking, folks. We need some hope. We need something that's beyond ourselves, something that's bigger and greater that we can only be open to when all of our best case scenarios have been exhausted, when wishing won't cut it anymore, when going on our own is no longer an option. A few years ago, I was visiting a museum that's dedicated to Native American art, and I walked into the atrium, and there was this beautiful wall hanging several stories tall. And I don't know if you've ever done this or not, but I just turned to the person next to me who I did not know and just said, "Wow, isn't that pretty?" Well, her head snapped around, and she said, "Pretty? Pretty?" She said, "Weaving for the Native American is a sacred art. That's more than pretty." She said, "It embodies creation stories and prayers and ceremonial practices, the ancient and historical past." And she wasn't done. She said, "In weaving, the individual preserves the hoso, the concept that combines beauty and balance and harmony." And gosh, I thought it was pretty. And she went on. She said, "Do you see at the bottom that red thread, that scarlet thread? It starts there, and as it works its way up the fabric, there are places where it's very bright and places where it seems to tuck beneath and disappear until at the end, it's there in a brilliant flourish." She said, "I think that's the hope of the people." I thought it was pretty. But, it got me to thinking, don't we have a sacred story that has running through it a scarlet thread of hope? Do we not have a story from Genesis to Revelation that thinks about what it would be like for creation that has rebelled against God to be reconciled to that same God, the generous Creator who made us all? Wouldn't that be a wonderful and hopeful thread? And think about the ways that it moves through the Scripture. The thread, some places we see it bright and others not so much. Early in Genesis, we have Abram and Sarai who are promised by God that they will be heirs to a nation that will number more than the stars in the sky. And boy, the hope is bright on the fabric until we learn just how old they are. My son was in middle school at the time. I remember when I was preaching on that particular text, he turned to his mother and said, "Well, if they were buying diapers, it wasn't for babies." You got to have a middle school son to understand that. But the thread kind of tucks beneath the fabric, but God does this remarkable thing. And do you remember that in her old age, she gives birth to the child whose name is Isaac, which in Hebrew means laughter, and the thread is back on the fabric again where we can see it. Think about how those stories go over and over. Moses and the children of Israel under Pharaoh's bondage. The thread of hope is tucked beneath the fabric for a while, but then after the 10th plague, Pharaoh relents and releases the children and says, "Go, get out of my sight." And the thread of hope pops up on the fabric for a moment. But you remember Pharaoh has a change of heart. And the children of Israel find themselves between the Red Sea and the charging army and the chariots and horsemen. And it looks like hope is going to disappear here. But God does this remarkable thing. And the waters part. The children of Israel cross through on the dry land. And then the waters sweep over Pharaoh's chariots and horsemen. And the thread of hope is bright on the fabric again. Over and over, this theme goes on in both Testaments. Even as the children of Israel are trying to take the promised land, you'll remember that for a while things are going pretty good and the thread's pretty bright, but then they come to the great walled city of Jericho. And it looks like things are going to stop here, right? But you remember this story. Maybe you went to Sunday school as a kid and you remember this story. That there's a couple of interesting details here, that there were a couple of spies who went into the city, and they encountered a prostitute of all people named Rahab. And she gave aid to them, and she was promised in exchange for that if she let a scarlet cord down from her window in the wall in which she lived, that her life would be spared. You remember this? And so on the seventh day, after the children of Israel had been marching around the city, they finally blow the shofar, the ram's horn, they give a great shout to God, and down come the walls of Jericho. And you know, if you look in the lineage of Jesus, do you know whose name you will find there? Rahab. On and on the stories go. A God who gives life in the midst of barrenness. For Hannah and Elizabeth, we get Samuel and John the Baptist, prophets who continue to hold out hope against hope, that the world might be as God imagined it to be, with people doing justice and loving mercy and walking humbly with their Creator. And then we get to the life of Jesus. Now, the thread is really bright here. Right? In the life, in the teachings, in the miracles, in the wondrous life of Jesus Christ, we see the thread as bright and bold on the fabric it can be until that moment when he hangs between heaven and earth on the cross. And it looks as though the thread of hope will be cut here. But God does this remarkable thing. And on the third day, Jesus is raised to new life, and the thread of hope now stands bright on the fabric again. Now, when we get to the book of Acts, we're kind of in this mode again of the thread of hope, weaving in and out, seeing it and not seeing it. There's a concern. You might remember when the book of Acts opens that Jesus has ascended into heaven. Jesus has effectively left the building. Now what? That's the question the book of Acts wants to answer. How will the ministry of Jesus, how will the power of the resurrected Christ manifest itself in the church now that Jesus is gone physically from their presence? And Luke, who is the author of the book of Acts, wants us to know and tells us in stories over and over again that by the power of the Holy Spirit, Christ is still present. There is still great hope. The story that was read for you today from the 9th chapter of Acts is one of those stories. It's one of those. It's a resurrection story. Did you hear how it began? There was a disciple whose name was Tabitha. Let me just say that again, make sure you heard that. There was a disciple whose name was Tabitha. Same Greek word used for all the men who provide leadership in the church. Why in the world we ever fussed about what women could do in church, I don't know. Because right there it says there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha. In the Greek, Dorcas. Now that's unfortunate. Well, there's another way to translate that word. You can translate that word gazelle. Yeah. There was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, in the Greek, gazelle, who was dedicated to good works and acts of charity. Please do not lose sight of that phrase. That's really, really important. Now she becomes sick and she dies, and it creates a crisis in the church. Peter, the apostle, is nearby, and he is summoned to come at once. I don't know if you've noticed it, but in the Gospels, in the book of Acts, there's a lot of running around going on. People are always in a hurry. There's always urgency at stake. And here is another case where that is so. And so Peter comes at once. And when he finds this community that has called him in its grief, he finds the widows gathered around Gazelle's body. And they show the tunics that she had woven for them when she was alive. You see, in the ancient world, there was no system of support for the widows. If your family was gone, if you were a widow and you didn't have any immediate family to take care of you, you were at the mercy of the kindness and generosity of others. And this had been Gazelle's ministry. This is the work that Tabitha had done. And they are now grief-stricken, and they wonder what will be next for them. And they're gathered in an upper room. Did you hear that? That sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? And so Peter puts everyone out, and he starts to pray. Now, I don't know if you've ever noticed this or not, but if you're reading the Gospel of Luke, before anything big ever happens in Jesus' ministry, you know what he does? He prays. And in the book of Acts, before the church does anything big, before anything significant happens through the work of the apostles, you know what they're doing? They're praying. There's probably something for us to learn there. He prays, and then he gets up and he looks at the body and he says, Tabitha, get up. And she does. This is a resurrection story, church. There aren't a lot of those. That suggests to me that we ought to be paying attention to this. There's something significant going on for us to hear. And I think Luke basically has two things he wants to tell us. The first is very clear, that the resurrection power of Jesus Christ is still at work and alive in the church through the teaching of the apostles, because that's what Peter represents. But there's something else I hear. Maybe you heard it too. The church can't be church without being like Tabitha. You see, if the point was just to raise someone from the dead to prove that the resurrection power of work was still at work in the church, well, frankly, any dead body would have done, right? I mean, there had to be plenty of them to go find, right? Any dead body would have done, but it wasn't any dead body. It was Tabitha, the one who was dedicated to good works and acts of charity. You see, we're being told we can't be church without being like Tabitha. This is God's promise that the same God who had said in the First Testament that the widow, the orphan, the alien, the disenfranchised, that those folks mattered to God, that it was the church's responsibility to take care of those folks on behalf of God, that same spirit is going to live on in this new church, in this new work that God is doing. God is not going to abandon them. That's good news for the church, isn't it? You see? The idea that we need to be generous. Now, I'll be the first to admit that generosity is not easy, right? I mean, it kind of takes something from us. It demands something from us. It is not something casual. It is an investment that we make. It is where we choose one thing over another in order to be truly generous. And frankly, that can be a little scary sometimes, right? I mean, really, you got to let go of that fear and replace it with just a little bit of faith so that maybe we can move from despair to hope. Because you see, with a little bit of faith comes the ability to trust. And well, with a little bit of trust, you can muster up a little courage, can't you? And well, if you find a little bit of courage, you might be able to take a risk. And well, with the ability to take a risk comes the power to change. And with the power to change comes the possibility of a different future. And with the possibility of a different future comes real hope. Hope that's not merely optimism. It's not merely the power of positive thinking, but it's grounded in the reality of God's ability to bring life in the face of death. Tabitha is raised by the power of Jesus at work in the church. Where Jesus is, there's real power. Power to become a community of radical trust, a community of true generosity, a community that might be able to weave with a thread of hope. You see, I've seen that thread of hope. It looks different in different places. I bet you've seen it too, but I remember seeing it very specifically in a place in Guatemala when I was there on a mission trip. We worshiped on a Sunday morning in a place called La Isla. Now, if you know Spanish, that sounds like that might have been a really nice place, because that sounds like island, right? Well, it was an island, but it wasn't an island surrounded by water. What it was an island of garbage. And at La Isla, there's a community of people who, in the extreme poverty in Guatemala, live inside of the garbage dump. They have pulled from the garbage 2x4s and corrugated metal and cinder block and steel, and they have built a community there. We worshiped in a church on a Sunday morning where I saw this thread of hope in rebar that was sticking up from cinder blocks in the corner, that was their hope they'd be able to put a roof over this space in which we worship, which at the time was covered by tattered tarps to keep the hot sun off of us as we gathered to celebrate the presence of Jesus Christ. You see, these folks in that kind of poverty had not abandoned the idea that God had abandoned them. They loved the idea that God was still with them. They had hope that God had not abandoned them where they were. In fact, to give you an idea of the poverty, the extent of the poverty, after the worship service, we ventured into one of these little huts that a family was living in, and I became pretty upset right away because in the corner of this little hut was a baby, maybe about 6 or 8 months old, and he was surrounded by layer after layer of chicken wire. And I remember asking the father through the translator, what's with the chicken wire? And his response was immediate. He said, that's to protect the baby from the rats. And yet in that poverty, they did not believe that God had abandoned them. They were still holding on to hope. The thread of hope looks different in different places. I think it looks like churches that through your gifts to Disciple Mission Fund are in neighborhoods that have radically changed over the last 25 or 30 years, and the neighborhoods on the outside of the church don't look a lot like the few people who are left on the inside of the church, but through generous gifts to Disciple Mission Fund, these congregations are seeking to revitalize and revision who God has called them to be where they are, because they don't believe God is finished with them yet. They believe that there's a ministry for them in these neighborhoods with people who don't look or talk like them. It looks different in different places. It looks like the refugee and resettlement ministry that we have, where folks who have legally entered this country are finding the hope and promise that we hold out for the best of who we are as a country, and folks who are also at the border, standing for the humanity of all individuals as children of God. The thread of hope looks different in different places. You might have found it just yesterday at Front Porch Friends, where a group of you gathered to feed the homeless in your community, picking them up from the camps and places where they hang out and bringing them here to provide a breakfast for them. It might have been seen in the Manna Storehouse ministry you carry on, where people turn the stuff we discard into prescriptions and rent assistance and food. The thread of hope looks different in different places. It looks a lot like Bunny in the Crossroads ministry, where you offered generosity, and that generosity is flowing back in so many ways, taking homeless kids off the street, many of who've been turned out from their own families, and you are helping them with a thread of hope. Habitat for Humanity. Think of all the ways in which providing a home for someone who has their own sweat equity, and it gives them a sense of dignity and purpose and lifts them up in the community around them. The thread of hope looks different in different places, whether it's your Water Wells project in Africa or Grace House or the food bank distribution that you do in this community. Maybe Freedom House, where battered women have a safe place to be as they seek to regroup and reorder their lives, and you give them a thread of hope. It looks different in different places. I'm pretty sure it looks like Rose. You've never met Rose. I've never met Rose, though I would love to, but it's unlikely we'll ever go to Buffalo Flats, South Africa, where Rose works with a little bit of Disciple Mission Fund overseas dollars that we share together as the church. You know what she does there? Rose takes in the dying off the street, the people who've been put out by their own families because they're dying of AIDS. And she takes them into her home, and she comforts them and embraces them with the love of Christ until they pass. The thread of hope looks different in different places. And can I tell you sometimes it's just a thread. My wife, Laura, is a cancer survivor. And years ago, when she began treatment, the women in her CWF circle bought a skein of yarn and some knitting needles, and it went from house to house to house. And the reason we know it went a number of different places is because, when you hold up the blanket, you can see some were a little better with the needles than others. Right? But you see, every place where it started and stopped is a place we know where she was prayed for as she was undergoing treatment. It's a place where the boys and Rebecca and I were prayed for as we walked with her as caregivers on this terribly frightening journey called cancer. It was a place, you see, where we knew we were not alone. And can I tell you something? It really is the warmest blanket in the house. Because our hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. We dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly trust in Jesus' name. On Christ, the solid rock, we stand. All other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. In just a few minutes, we gather in the courtyard. You're going to be given an opportunity to state what your investment is in the mission and ministry that God has called you to in this place. I want you to realize that what you hold in your hand is not simply a commitment card, but it's the thread of hope. What will you dare to weep with?